Mr. Mearsheimer, it's largely taken for granted in the West that Russia's aggressive behavior is responsible for the crisis in Ukraine. However, in your Foreign Affairs article, you place the blame for the crisis primarily on the USA and its European allies. Why?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, there's hardly any reason to believe that Putin caused this crisis, that he started it. The principal cause of the crisis is the fact that the West has been intent on peeling Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and making it part of the West. And this involved NATO expansion to the east to include Ukraine, EU expansion to the east to include Ukraine, and promoting democracy in Kiev, which was just another way of putting in power leaders in Kiev who were pro-Western or pro-American. Now, from a Russian point of view, this is unacceptable. Ukraine is a piece of territory that is of vital strategic interest to Russia, and Russia is simply not going to allow it to become part of the West.
I'll come back to this question. We have seen how the West has initiated the Ukrainian coup d'etat with financial support for pro-Western personalities and organizations. Which interests are the United States following by supporting this regime change?
Well, it's not clear that the United States initiated this coup. I think the United States supported it, but we don't have enough evidence at this point in time to say that the United States initiated it, and I don't think in the end we will be able to show that. What the United States was trying to do was put into power a Ukrainian leader who was pro-Western and anti-Russian. And Yanukovych, who was the president of Ukraine before the coup, was pro-Russian and not very friendly with the West. And the West was therefore enthusiastic about getting rid of him and putting in a regime that was more pro-Western. And of course, after the February 22nd coup, that's exactly what happened.
Which interests are threatened by the actions of the NATO powers?
Well, Russia's interests are threatened because Russia has a vested interest in making sure that Ukraine is either neutral or allied with Russia. It's just unacceptable for the Russians to have a next-door neighbor that is part of the NATO alliance, just like it would be unacceptable for the United States to have a next-door neighbor that was allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War or in some future scenario was allied with a powerful China. Great powers care greatly about their neighborhood, and they don't want countries in their neighborhood allying with or becoming close friends with distant great powers.
What, in your opinion, would happen if the USA and the EU countries would directly support Ukraine militarily?
Well, what we're talking about here is arming the Ukrainians. There's no talk about the United States or the West Europeans fighting in Ukraine. We're talking about arming the Ukrainians. And if that were to happen, it would be disastrous because the Russians would counter-escalate. The crisis or the war in Ukraine would become more intense. It would escalate. More people would die. And the relationship between the West and Russia would get much worse. So arming the Ukrainians would not make a bad situation better, it would make a bad situation worse.
How would the major powers involved have to change the policies to settle this crisis?
Well, I think that the West has to take the main initiative, and what the West has to do is say that it is no longer going to try to make Ukraine a Western bulwark. And instead, what it's going to do is make Ukraine a neutral buffer state between Russia on one side and the West on the other side. And this involves taking NATO expansion off the table, it involves taking EU expansion off the table, and it involves no more democracy promotion if that democracy promotion is intended to put pro-Western leaders in control in Kiev.
Mr. Mearsheimer, thank you very much for this interview.
My pleasure.